Ms. Higel, I would like to start with you on the question of Iraq's political parties, new alliances, and how this changes things since Iraq's new constitutional order was established in 2005. Looking back at elections since 2005, would you say has this government formation process represented a new chapter among Iraqi political actors and how they engage in government formation, or is just more or less the same thing? And after you, I'll throw it to Dr. Zmkan and Zmkan.
Right, thank you. Well, I think that certainly many political actors, or at least the Iraqi street, was hoping that this would be a departure from old government formation processes, but I think it has proved that it is not. At the end of the day, since 2005, forming a government has very much been about state capture, rather, different political parties wanting access to state institutions, access to funds through the ministries, and therefore we've seen the type of political apportionments according to the system that has dominated this process since 2005. Now, what has been unprecedented, I think, in this election is that the gap between the so-called winners and the losers was quite big. Sadat didn't make, he won, and it was quite a big win relatively to those that came second, especially within the Shia bloc. But if you look back at some of the elections in the past, we've actually had alliances or parties gaining 80, 90 seats in parliament. So in this sense, this was unprecedented, but it was really the gap, I think. So you had Sadr winning clearly on the Shia side, the KDP, and then Taqaddum, and joined later by Azman forming the Sovereignty Alliance. And so the fact that they have tried to form a so-called majority government, I think, is what we've seen as an attempted departure. But it's proven that this is not really possible in Iraq, because at the end of the day, you need to share the pie with the others in order not to run into trouble. And so we've seen all these steps by the opposing side, legal intimidations, still low levels of violence to kind of make sure that we come back to the consensus governance that we've always had.
Thank you. Dr. Mack and then Dr. Zmkan.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Barron. I want to hear more from Lahib about this component of state capture and how state capture has evolved over time. We've seen different forms of state capture. And I think what we're seeing now is quite a, you might say, the climax of a process that's been unfolding for over a decade or so. But let me focus on 2 points. So the big picture here is, okay, is what we're seeing different this time around than last time, different than 2011, 2014, 2018? A couple of dynamics that I think are worth noting. One is in the Sunni blocs, there's always been this concern. You hear not only from Iraqi political actors, but also from the Americans and other international parties at each election. Will the Sunnis be represented or not? Will they be included or not? Will they have a voice? You haven't heard really anybody asking that question this time around. Why? Because there was this kind of coming together within the Sunni Arab blocs, which is really no small thing. To have Khanja and Halbusi forming this alliance, which appears to be rather coherent at the moment, is a dynamic that we really haven't seen in Iraqi politics in the post-2003 era. Now, what this will lead and whether that actually means that Sunnis as citizens have some sort of better representation now is another question, right? So the fact that there is sort of an agreement among national level Sunni Arab elites does not necessarily mean you have something called representation. But that's another question. So one point is we've gone from a picture of Sunni Arab fragmentation, and I wouldn't even say fragmentation, just incoherence. There really hasn't been much of a national level coming together at that level until this election. And so we'll see what happens there. I think in terms of other dynamics, Ms. Lahib, she mentioned that this attempt to form a national majority government is somehow unique. And I think that is true to an extent. But you also see that political discourses can be flipped on their head for about the same reason from one election to another. So if you think about 2014, around June or July, when we still didn't have a government, you had Muqtada Sadr come out and say, we need to have basically an authentic unity government. And what he meant at that time, and he used words like we need to have new faces. We need to have faces that represent all Iraqis. Now what he meant was we need to have new faces that aren't Nouri Maliki, right? But he was using the discourse of a unity government at that time, because that's the discourse that you had to use in the post-2003 era. It was the sort of internationally backed idea that everyone should be included. Now he's using the sort of discourse of a majority government also to try and isolate Maliki. So in a way, you're using different political ideologies for a similar kind of purpose. Of course, now we're seeing that these two sides are having to come together just because of the math isn't working out. But it is interesting how you can have really just similar dynamics that are redressed in different discursive clothing.
Dr. Mack, thank you, Dr. Mack. Dr. Zmkan.
Thanks, Doug. I think there's a lot of continuity. I appreciate the change that you both focused on. What I see outside the opposition groups that emerged in the KRI and the rest of Iraq, and they are a player, but not in the government formation. The key stakeholders, the parties are the same, with the same objectives, but slightly they're playing the game differently. They have the same mentality, they're the same people, they're the same as Ali, Amiri, Maliki, Barzanis, and Talibanis. Let's be quite blunt about this. Their objective in government formation is to expand their position, gain greater control of the state, as Lahib said, prepare for the next stage. This is the goal. Slightly different plane of the game is we have a polarization. I don't know whether I call it losers, but a polarization and alliance between the winners of the election and the powerful losers of the elections. So you have pro-Iran factions. The war with ISIS resulted in the redistribution of power in their favor. It's the pro-Iran militia parties. Later, their harsh response to the protests in Baghdad, the killing of Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Muhandis, and the poor handling of the new law resulted in their weakness. Right now, the other side, there is, for reasons that are specific to each party, Sadr, the Sunnis, and the KDP, they want to manipulate this and build themselves and have greater control over the state and its resources, and expand their influence both in Baghdad and within their constituencies across Iraq.
Thank you. To continue with you, Dr. Zmkan, speaking of novelties and continuities, how do you interpret the other panelists too? The public divergence between the PUK and the KDP since 2017. There doesn't seem to be a Kurdistan list in Baghdad this time, a Kurdistan bloc in Baghdad this time. On the one hand, you have the KDP allying with the Sadrists and the Sunni Arab blocs, and PUK seeking its own way. How does that comport with what we've discussed so far?
Right. So,
speak to that.
yeah. So the question was to me, right?
Starting with you, but also
Okay.
I'd love to know.
So,
other
I'm really
panelists
sorry if I
to bring the topic to Kurdistan too, because
Yeah.
That's obviously, if the second big question, as I mentioned, after Ukraine, then Iraq's new government, then what's going to happen to Kurdistan? What about PUK? What about KDP? How do they go forward from here? So yes.
So I'm sorry if I hurt
you
feelings of anybody here tied to the PUK or KDP, but I don't really think that the depth of the division between these two parties are understood well. The problem for here, thinking in the frameworks of the parties, we didn't have an agreement for a candidate between the PUK and the KDP. Their end game for the PUK, this is an existential matter. It's of huge symbolic significance. It's about the legacy of their former leader. They want to have it, and therefore they've done what they could to regain this position. And it's also, it's important for the image of the PUK, both here home in the KRI and the rest of Iraq. They want to say to people, we have something, given the fact that they've been losing in the KRI to the KDP in the past 10 years. We know that the KDP is way more powerful. They control the oil sector, international relations with the West. They have the president's position, the prime minister's position. And for that same reason, the KDP doesn't want to treat the PUK anymore as a partner, actually as a worthy partner. They want to go to Baghdad, present their dominance here in the KRI to the rest of Iraq. Of course, I understand that there has been a shift in the KDP strategy that, look, we lost in the referendum bid. Now we've shown to the Kurdish people in Iraq that we are the dominant. They want to go and take it to Baghdad and say we are the sole powerful Kurdish party that we wanted to lead everything related in Iraq to Kurdistan. So it's not about, we've been hearing, probably is about KDP trying to use this negotiations about, filling this position in Baghdad. People are talking about KDP trying to get concession from the PUK on Kirkuk. I don't really know how, because PUK does not control Kirkuk, and to have a new government in Kirkuk takes a lot more than PUK and the KDP. So I think the end game from the KDP side is to assert its dominance in Baghdad over the KRG. They don't have control over Suli, and I don't think they want to overrun it, just because this region is divided both territorially and in military terms. They don't like this, but they would like to have PUK always as a partner, and they know that the PUK does not. They can't afford breaking up the region, because KDP sees the strife within the PUK, the struggle of the PUK to provide services to this place. The imbalance is rooted in 1998, and it became really obvious since that point. So I guess even if there is an agreement, which is really difficult now, to have one candidate and present a unified platform to Baghdad as Kurdistan, as the parties claim here, which nobody believes anymore. This is about party gains. It will be on the KDP's term, either on the KDP's term or separate competition. 2018, what we've seen at that time. Sorry, I think it took long.
One thing maybe to follow up there, and perhaps as a question also to Zmkan and Lahib, is that, obviously the PUK and the KDP for the last 15 years, well, really even longer than that, have had a very dynamic struggle over resources in this region. But whenever there's been sort of a major existential challenge in the form of grassroots opposition, so with the Quran movement, for instance, you saw that both parties sort of came together to isolate what they perceived was this sort of external threat. And so even when Quran won, what was it, 25 seats or something in the KRG parliament, they really weren't able to turn that into a lot of influence, because the KDP and the PUK basically colluded to isolate them and to make sure that whatever ministerial positions they had were not really meaningful ministerial positions, right? And so you saw a a disjuncture between electoral power and actual power, because these two parties had such a strong kind of, collusive arrangement. Will that be possible anymore going forward? My inclination is to say probably to some degree, but what that form of collusion will take may be a bit different. I don't think it will be quite as easy, but do you have any thoughts on that? Because that really gets also to our question of state capture in general. These parties have, whatever the election results are, they still have these assets that allow them to control certain facts on the ground.
Well, I mean, maybe just coming back quickly to the question of continuity versus novelty. I think that, Zmkan, I agree with you in terms of much of what we see is continuity, but perhaps where we see the most novelty is actually on the Kurdish side and on the Sunni side that Matt mentioned, in the sense that, okay, in Kurdistan, they will continue to collude, obviously, against external threats within their environment. But in Baghdad, as you mentioned, it's very clear what the KDP is trying to do, and I think this is a departure that they will try to stick to. And then on the state capture side of things, I think that the war on ISIS didn't change this equation entirely, but it definitely spread out the different geographical areas where some of these groups that, let's say, were the victors of the war against ISIS really benefited from. And so now, and obviously, the groups that we are talking about are those under the Shia coordination framework within the Hashid. Their expansion into new areas where they didn't really have a presence in before, so in the disputed territories, in the liberated areas, has really put them in a position where they still have an upper hand despite having lost, lost or not gained as much as 2018 in the elections. And so, for me, even as I was looking at these new constellations, and I believe what Mac is saying, that, Sadr's narrative about this is more discourse than its actual reality, because we know that it's like almost impossible to do. I was, wondering what the reasoning, especially of the KDP, was, because there must have been an understanding that, Sadr cannot deliver on all these things, especially considering that the closest neighbors in the disputed territories to the Kurdish parties, and in particular the KDP, are the Hashid groups. Sadr does not really have any control in these areas to be, able to deliver on certain promises or demands that I'm sure that the KDP would naturally have. So yes, we're coming back to what this constellation has looked like before, and underneath the surface, these groups that were the main victors of the war against ISIS still actually have significant power to be able to stop whatever political attempts there might be to marginalize them.
Okay, so one thing that I've been a bit confused about on that front, and I think you make an incredibly important point, that in the post-ISIS moment, we used to think, whenever we thought about, Mahasasa, we used to think, okay, we have these different ministries, and after government formation, the parties, they take different ministries, one party gets interior, one party gets whatever. But then in the post-ISIS area, we're not just thinking about ministries, we're thinking more about territory. We're thinking about these kind of looser assets that don't have a kind of strict parameters around them. And because of that looseness, they're very valuable. But what's been confusing to me is, so if the parties that are related to the Hashid are the ones that are most proximate to the KRG, and they're also the ones that have this kind of dominance across the Sunni Arab territories, how was it that Khanjar and Halbusi felt that they could take a tact that was clearly against the interests of the Hashid? When the Hashid has influence in Kirkuk, they have influence in Diyala, they have influence in Salah ad-Din, they have influence in Ninawa, to some extent on the peripheries of Anbar. So how did that work? Is that just a question of them evolving and essentially over time having some power to themselves, both electorally and in terms of economic access, or is it, or was it really a very bold move?
There's so many layers to that question, I think, but I will try to address a few of them. So first of all, I think that depending on which areas you look of the Sunni territories, the reality is quite different, right? So I think in Anbar, for instance, where a very homogeneous area, sure, the Hashid have their lines and access into Syria, and they're able to maintain that with relatively little friction with the Sunni community there. And I think this is also what has, for quite some time, Halbusi and the Hashid parties didn't really have major issues, right? If you move on to Salahuddin, the reality looks quite different. And so, I think that there, some of the Sunni political leaders have also accepted quite severe grievances on part of some of the population that is still suffering under the dominance of these Hashid parties. So yes, them coming together is a bold move, but also it wasn't quite their own doing, right? I mean, if it wasn't, I think, for Turkey and the UAE support, we would probably not have seen this. So external guarantees, or whatever we want to call them, probably also helped this move, I would say. But I mean, the reactions to it initially were quite serious on part of the Shia parties within the framework. So yes, I mean, it was a bold move, but I think it has proven, at least for now, to be constructive for the Sunnis.
I think it's both bold move and kind of a rethinking the alliance with, I know that how Halbusi looks vulnerable, Halbusi and Khanjar. Previously, they built themselves on the help of Fatah alliance. He literally got the seat of speaker through Amri support. But now, how is it that he actually going against them and aligned with Sadr is because he basically got some promise, access to coercive capacity, maybe the ISF, and maybe he got some promises from Sadr himself. So a few times when Kataib Hezbollah paraded through Anbar and came close really to Halbusi's, Sadr issued warnings that don't intimidate because they are not alone. So I know, I mean, I absolutely agree with Lahib that external support, and also it was just a calculation that do I align with losers of the elections or two powerful actors with coercive capacity, both the KDP and Sadr.
Very quickly, how do you folks see the influence of the protest movement that started in 2019? How does Imtidad, the Extension Party, play into all of this, if it does? And then we can move on to probably discussing international powers, because they came up nice seg to our next section in the panel. Anyone?
Yeah, I can start. So I think that for now we don't see much influence of the new parties. Obviously, I mean they 9 seats on part of Imtidad, and then same thing with New Generation, and then a few with some of the new parties is not going to make a huge difference. I think that they are waiting this period out to see where government formation is going to. And I think that some of them are also quite happy over the phone call between Maliki and Sadr and the meeting that has been held between them, hoping that they might actually come to a consensus government again, because it would benefit this new opposition, right? If the Itaris would also be in opposition, how are they going to make their voices heard? So I think for them, challenging the system that people were in the streets for, it's important that that system, at least, in looks, is still coherent in Parliament for them to have something to fight against. So I think their role is not really relevant in this kind of government formation process period, but will be later on.
Once there is a government, of course.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a strong statement, but I think the most likely scenario is that these strong political parties, the stakeholders, once they form a government, they will start co-opting, colluding against these opposition groups, just because their influence is limited by the number of seats. Ultimately, the Quran model is going to be repeated unless they take a different strategy, build themselves incrementally, connection with the rest of Iraq. Don't do it inside parliament, a day one confrontation. They need to take it really, I don't like to prescribe this to them, but they'll have to use the next 4 years to build themselves rather than go for public challenges because the system is going to absorb them.
I would say two things. I do think that there is a bit of hope because, after the elections when Imtidad had, what was it, around 9 seats, there was some feeling that, okay, this is about the right amount. Because if we got too much more, it would be like a Quran situation and everybody would have to destroy us. If we had a lot less, then we'd be totally irrelevant. But I do think, so we've already seen some divisions within Imtidad, very troubling divisions. And it really remains to be seen whether or not this group will be able to be a kind of opposition. I think Lahib's point is very interesting, that they may actually kind of rejoice about this kind of coming together on within the Shia side. I think in terms of political discourse, though, their impact has been felt. I don't think you would have this kind of Sadr, coming out and repeatedly asserting that we're doing a national majority government or whatever that means now, if it hadn't been for the protest and this kind of, because Sadr does like to position himself as sort of this voice of the people, and that's a big part of the way that the Sadrist movement works. Now, obviously, does the protest movement accept Sadr as their leader? Of course not. But from Sadr's perspective, him embodying some sort of narrative that is seen to link to the protest movement was appealing to him. So I think in terms of the nature of the political ideological conversation, the impact has been felt.
Thank you all. Let's move on to the international scene, if you will, both at the actor level, but also what's happening around the world right now with Ukraine, the price of oil. So whenever we discuss Iraqi politics in general, but especially government formation, it would almost be a maxim to say, the United States and Iran agreed on the new constellation of Iraqi leadership after the elections, and so you'd have the speaker, you'd have the president, you'd have the prime minister, and they would do their best. They'd try their best. Besides the United States and Iran, how do you see the influence of other regional actors, international actors like Turkey, United Arab Emirates, or even Qatar, possibly Egypt and Jordan in this government formation process? So that's the actor side, but how do you see, and the second part of the question I understand is going to be a bit more vague, but how do you see the cascade effects of the war in Ukraine, how that's affecting the Iran nuclear deal, and how that might impact Iran's position on government formation efforts in Iraq, and to the extent to which they would cooperate with the United States, the extent to which Tehran would cooperate with Washington or not in the process of Iraq government formation. So two-part question. One, the regional actors, mostly the regional actors. And then second, how do you see the broader international system having an impact on Iraq government formations?
Okay. So you mentioned a lot of countries there. I think that Turkey
Choose
and
your pick, you don't have to go through.
Yeah.
Obviously.
So, I mean, Turkey and the UAE, I think, definitely played a role prior to the elections and the immediate aftermath. I don't think that it's, at the same level right now. I think that, one of their main aims, of course, was related to the Sunni component specifically, and that result they achieved. But then I think there's also, and I mean, of course, there's been a rapprochement between the UAE and Turkey, which is interesting in the case of Iraq. But they're also very different actors when it comes to Iraq. Turkey has obviously a long history in this country, have a very specific, national interest that or security interests that they pursue in this country, versus the UAE, which is quite new, I would say, and where you have other Gulf countries that are still trying to, I would say, balance against whatever the UAE is trying to do, right? So on the part of the Shia parties, there's a bigger conspiracy looming in the background that, in extension, this whole intervention is about drawing Iraq closer to normalization with Israel, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, that is extremely far-fetched. But the fear is there, and there are other actors in the background that I think are moderating whatever direction that Iraqi foreign policy might take, and Qatar is there. Although Qatar has also been a part of this understanding, obviously not going against, Khanjar stepping into the alliance with Halbusi, for instance. So I think that's one part of it. And we've seen that the US has taken more of a backseat. Iran also, in the beginning, I mean, it was interesting to see Iran's shifting kind of approach to Iraq in letting the Iraqi actors try to deal with the government formation process themselves until they sort of hit a wall, and Iran also saw, the potential danger that they consider for themselves, which is that the Iraqi Shia parties won't actually stick together. So one of the main points in pushing on the framework, although, Sadr and Amiri, for instance, very initially had conversations, Amiri wouldn't mind joining Sadr and being part of the government, but obviously was persuaded not to leave the framework, but for the framework to stick together. And I think in general for the aim of the framework, that has worked really well. I mean, Sadr hasn't been able to pull any one of them. So Iran's, let's say, at least, basic level of intervention remains. That's very clear. And then lastly on, how the Ukraine crisis is impacting us. I mean, what we saw in terms of the missile strike on Erbil, I think, is already an indication of that. So obviously the background to it was that IRGC officers had been struck in Syria. I mean, that might just have been a trigger. But really there are a lot of other things at play at the same time, right? Just a couple of days before, Sadr and Maliki had a conversation. Afterwards, Sadr comes out with his same mantra of neither Eastern nor Western. So again, it's not looking like we're pushing in the right way that the Iranians want with the government formation. At the same time, the Russians have put in new demands into the nuclear negotiations. Whereas before, the negotiations of the JCPOA had been quite insulated, despite tensions between the US and Russia. And so this has, changed that prospect significantly. It was already hanging on a very kind of thin thread, and now the question is whether this agreement is in jeopardy. And so, of course, accordingly, Iran's actions in the region might also change. And as we've seen, it's also put question into whether the Saudi-Iranian talks can move on, with Iran very recently withdrawing from the round that was supposed to take place, and which Fuad Hussein announced at the Antalya Forum not long ago.
Mm-hmm. So, just a few words about Iran. Iraq is a strategic depth for the Iranian. They will stay here. They want to be the most influential actor that shapes event in Iraq. And because of that, they come in head-to-head with other actors, be they regional or international. I know that there's just thinking about the JCPOA, the revitalizing the nuclear agreement. The idea is that if you have this agreement, then this would moderate Iranian role in Iraq. There will be less tension with the United States. I think that's not true. I think what you have Iran, the firing of the missile, the ballistic missiles yesterday was partly telling the international community or the regional actors, local actors, even if I have an agreement of my nuclear technology, and I'm still here, and I have the means, instrument to make myself present here, especially to people who see themselves as aligning with competitors of Iran. Unless you have a fundamental shift in the regional security structure, then with or without an agreement, you will have tension and conflict. And because Iraq's sovereignty, because of this lack of cohesion, no, but the least the neighboring countries do is respect for Iraq's sovereignty and integrity. And with or without the agreement, you will have tension continuing, unfortunately, and Iraq's the playground always.
I think the sort of quiet role of the Americans has been quite interesting, and since Lahib and Zmkan have already sort of addressed the regional picture, maybe I'll think for a second about the picture from the U.S. side of things. I think if we look back in history, at 2007, 2011, 2014, what you would see after each of those kinds of government formation processes, you'd see the President of the United States or major U.S. officials come out with a statement saying, we're very happy about the government formation. We have an inclusive unity government. Inclusive unity government. That's what you heard every single time. And the idea was, if we don't have an inclusive government, you're going to have sectarian violence. And you're particularly going to have, insurgency, which is always sort of a euphemism for, Sunni Arab forms of political violence. That whole construct has broken down. You no longer have the U.S. kind of having a clear idea about what kind of Iraqi government makes sense to them anymore. You don't have them adopting, and in fact, behind the scenes, the U.S. Most indications that I get is that they were, quite happy about this whole sort of majority government push, right? Which is a major break from the historical precedent. I think if we look back and kind of try and break down what led to the U.S. position over so many years and why it has changed, one is that for many years their main concern was sort of having a baseline level of security and stability, and so the form of violence that they were most sort of focused on was this kind of very overt sectarian warfare, this kind of thing. They were ignoring other forms of violence, however. The kinds of corruption and institutional degradation and predation and state capture, that had to essentially be secondary because we needed to have sort of a focus on preventing what was at the time seemed to be the worst outcome, which is some kind of open sectarian warfare. And so I think for the U.S. side, they really at the moment don't have a clear idea of what sort of Iraqi government makes sense anymore. They've sort of accepted this idea that Muhassasa is a bad thing, even though for many years they thought it was the source of all stability in Iraq, right? So we will see what the U.S., what the internal debate ends up being, but I think right now they don't have a clear idea what they want.
Thank you, folks. Let's bring this home to the citizenry, to the people. One thing that has been striking and probably especially depressing for U.S. policymakers, has been the low turnout and the apparent voter apathy towards elections. What's in this for the citizenry? Thank you, Your Excellency. What's in this for the citizens of Iraq? How can we expand, bolster voter engagement, turnout rates in the next election? Do you see that happening? Because from an educator's point of view, we tell all of these young wonderful minds, our students, that there are these great things that are happening in the world, and we want those things for the Kurdistan region in Iraq, and then obviously the facts on the ground are somewhat different. But the second part of the question about citizenry is, how will the government formation process affect, turn some of the protest energy out there in the streets, such as the Tishreen protests, the occasional flare-ups here in Kurdistan. How do you think that will affect government formation? And once there is a government in place, how do you foresee the new government's engagement with protesters, and then hopefully using the next 3 or 4 or 5 years as a way to deliver services better, more efficiently, more honestly, so on and so forth? Should we go in the reverse order that we have? You want to take it?
Sure, I'll go first. Just a couple of points. As a foreign researcher, the first kinds of Arabic words that you learn when you are getting started in Iraq is a sort of vocabulary of state failure and people's disenchantment. You hear these kind of words, hakuma mako, right? This kind of kilowatt, right? These kinds of words really get to this sort of collective malaise around so it's not distrust in government, right? That's too nice of a word. It is absolute negation that there is any kind of power structure that can do anything for you, right? And that's a real troubling kind of place to be, right? And I think spending time in a lot of places of Iraq, you see that kind of depth of dissatisfaction across the board. However, there are certain regional differences, and there are levels of discontent and levels of marginalization. You do see, if we just think about, for instance, the Sunni Arab public, there is no one single Sunni Arab idea, right? If you go to certain places in southern Salahadin, right, and talk to people there, they have no hope that they can even really, leave their house and be safe, much less have some sort of, grand idea about the future, right? But if you're a Sunni Arab living in Ramadi, okay, you can at least have some sense that there is, a little bit of movement, a little bit of development, but you're still not, just elated that, all your problems have been solved or something. So I think there's a real, just across the board, discontent, and there isn't a clear way out of that. But across different provinces, there are certain levels and degrees of that.
Yeah, so I agree with that. At the same time, a very big portion of Iraqis are reliant on government employment, right? So, sure, you have this disenchantment, disillusionment, because the government is not able to provide the most basic services. But then at the same time, and I think this is also a part of the problem. If you look back at Tishreen, for instance, and some people asked, if the government employees would also have gone on strike, then the whole system would have unraveled. And maybe, but why do they not go on strike and onto the streets? Well, because that's how they make a living. And that's not just the 4 million that are on state payroll and whatever the additional 2 that receive pensions. They have extended families. So, you know, it's a very tricky combination where a population is also kind of held hostage in a way for as long as there is oil money at least. But coming back to one of your questions, which was about, you know, how is the citizenry, like, do they have an impact on the government formation process? No, I don't think so, not at the moment. We're not in a place where there is a significant fury in the streets, but we're seeing indications of that with the food prices, commodity prices rising globally, and that will also affect Iraq. So eventually, you know, that this might develop. And the thing is that the government is no better equipped now to respond to this than they were before. And even if we would have a majority government, you know, that is very unlikely to improve anything. So we will see more of this type of discontent. And I don't foresee that the next election is going to have, you know, a higher voter turnout, except for perhaps, and I think that this is the one thing that is interesting with the, let's call them the Tishrini parties, is that a significant number of them boycotted the elections, right? And they have an opportunity also looking at Imtidad's potential success or failure, you know, to revive at least a part of the constituency in the next elections. But this is still very, very small and is unlikely to have like a wider effect, I think.
Okay, I'll just focus on the KRI. I agree. Especially here, the gap is as wide as ever between the state and the society. But there is worry too here. The problem is, I agree with you that about this patronage and clientelism and the ties holding the whole population hostage to the parties. That works here, and it's quite obvious because everyday life is tied to a minimum cooperation and collaboration and collusion between the PUK and the KDP. Once there is tension, you feel it on the ground immediately. The problems that we had over the past week in Saleem, because the laser salary citizens are really shocked that oil prices are high, but they don't get their salaries on time, and the government is talking about even reducing the salaries. The problem here is that the parties are the same people. They don't have any strategy, no thinking about governance, no way to listen to what the people want, and that's why you have lots of people leaving this country. The total disbelief in this, in any form of change in the system. Sorry to put this kind of a cynical, put it in this way, but the idea go to these party leaders, the ruling family members and their organizations. Their mind is with how much do I get from the next government or from the oil sector and from the border crossings, and how do I use this to expand the patronage and ensure more and more voters during the next elections. I doubt that there is any thinking about providing a strategy to kind of reconcile with the population and with the citizenry is the same dynamic. The question that Mac asked, so what is their policy if you know, there are hashed around there, how do they really, the Kurdish parties deal, you know, without unity, how do they, you know, kind of make sure that they will have influence in the disputed territory? They don't have a strategy. They love kick the can down the road and see what happens. You know, maintain the status quo. Minimum collusion to prevent anyone outside of these parties, their families, and the framework. That's it. What happens next, it's not clear to them. But they don't. The only thing I know, they don't have a strategy. They don't have any strategy to talk to the population at all and reconcile them and include them in decision making.
And of course, you know, and I think both Dr. Zmkan and Lahib made important interventions there. The presence of disillusion does not mean that there is no such thing as political movements or agency. I mean, we see this in 2019. these were protests that were about this very disillusionment. And so disillusionment doesn't necessarily mean apathy, right? So all these kinds of, it is not to say that there is no kind of possibility that you won't see social mobilization and political movements that will continue to uprise and continue to put pressure on the Iraqi political system.
The fact that we have so many folks in here today is a testament to that. Thanks for that note, Dr. Mack. On that, with that said, I would like to open the floor to Q&A, questions and answers. We have about 25 minutes. Please raise your hand if you wish to ask a question, and then kindly introduce yourself. Please keep your questions brief, and if you wish, specifically address it to a panel member or any panel or all of the panelists, and try to keep it, as I said, in 30 seconds, and keep it as a question rather than an extended comment. So, Dr. Joy, did I see your hand? And please do wait for the microphone, because we're also recording. And then, gentleman there.
I guess, Dr. Zmkan addressed some of the questions I had. When I came here in 2013, the KRG was really prosperous. There was a lot of hope. AUI has got money from the government, so lots of good things were going on. And it seemed that part of the turmoil from 2014 when Daesh took Mosul is that there was a resource crunch. The oil price went down, the government had to fight a war at the same time that the government revenues had dried up. So there was a kind of dog-eat-dog competition in the political sphere. Now that the price of oil has shot up, does that open the prospect of some improvement, because the resource crunch has, I think, at least temporarily disappeared. And I totally agree with what you said about people leaving, and that's the better the student I have at AUR, the more eager they are to leave the country. So I hope that will change, but thank you.
Thank you. Shall I just go for it?
Please.
Yeah, I think for one thing is reinstate. The problem with this system. Basically, it's under the control, especially the oil sector, under the control of a few people. There is no way that they open up, as I said, the decision-making, deliberation, thinking about how to really use an improvement or rising oil prices to improve the government performance. That's not how they think. Always the party comes first. How do we make sure that the party expands, gains specific supporters in specific areas? The parties, when there's a rise in oil price, they come together, they redistribute in ways that serves them. Unfortunately, again, I haven't seen any evidence of the KRI leadership, both in the KDP and the PUK, wanting to diversify, use this extra money from rising oil prices to diversify the economy, to kind of improve the infrastructure. It's the higher the oil price, the less services we see, especially in Saleem. So you don't have a unified government. You've got to remember, the roads of Saleem are crumbling. You see that there are buildings of new roads in Erbil. So the kind of it's not a unified strategy. It's not thinking about the public interest. It is targeted provision of services that serves the interest of certain elites in power. So unless you have a political will and rethinking by these two parties, I don't really see any chance for improvement in the future, unfortunately, regardless of what the oil price is.
Espaço, eu espaço vou útil no أو تحليلاتانی کە کردان من عدنان حسێنم من پێم وایە ئەوە دەستان نەخستە سەر کێشە سەرەکیەکە لە عێراقا ئەویش نەبوونی دەوڵەتە لە عێراقا لە عێراقا کێشەکە ئەوەیە دەوڵەت نییە شتێک نای دەوڵەت بێت و تا دەوڵەت نەبێ هەر حکوومەتێک بێنە حکوومەتەکان هیچیان بۆ ناکرێت ئێمە بینیمان بە درێژایی ئەم چەند ساڵی ڕابردوو لە حکوومەتە جیاوازەکانە خەڵکی دیموکراتی شاد خەڵکی باشی شاد بەڵام هیچ شتێک لە عێراقا نەگۆڕێت لەبەرەوە شتێکمان نەبوو ناوی دەوڵەت بێت عادل عەبدولمەهدی کەسێک بوو بەڕاستی چاکسازی بکە بەڵام لەبەرەوەی شتێکی نەبوو بە ناوی دەوڵەت و کۆمەڵێ هێزی قوڵ هەن لە ئەو موسساتانی لە عێراقا هەیە و ئەمانە دەستیان کردووە بەسەر هەموو هێزانیەکانی عێراقا ئەمە وای کردووەکەوە هەر هێزێک بێ هەر حکومەتێک بێ نەتوانێت حکمی عێراق بکات چونکە ئەو نۆتەی کە لە بەسڕە هەیە و ئەو نۆتەی لە کەرکووک هەیە و ئەو نۆتەی لە ناوچەکانی کوردستانش هەیە ئەمە بە ئاشکرا تاڵانەکرێت دەبرێت بە بۆڕی لە ناوچەکانی هەرێمی کوردستان بە بەتەنکەر بفرۆشرێ ئەوە لە ناوچەکانی خواروی عێراق بۆڕەکان کوونەکرێ و بە شێوەی جیاوازتر ئەفرۆشرێت و جۆرێک دروست بووە ئەو میلیشیانە دەستیان بەسەر هەموو شتێکی عێراقا گرتووە و پێم وانییە موقتەدا سەدریش ئەو هیوا گەورەیە بێکەوە ئەمریکەکان هیوایان لەسەر هەڵچنی چونکە بەڕاستی موقتەدا سەدر بۆ خۆی بەشێک بووە لە هەموو خراپیانی کەوا ئێستا لە عێراقا هەیە و سەدر یەکەم کەس بوو لە عێراقا کوشتنی هێنایە کارەوە ئەو حەمید خۆیی کوشت کە ئەوەی یەکەم پرۆسەی کوشتن و یەکەم پرۆسەی تاوانکاری بوو لەو عێراقا نوێیە بۆیە ئەم مۆدێلە خراپەی ئەمریکیەکان و ئێرانیەکان پێڕێوان کردو لە 2004 مۆدێلێکی زۆر خراپە و چارەسەریش تەنها ئەوەیە کە حکوومەتێکی دروستکەن بۆ خۆیان کە هەموو لایەکتیا بەشدار بێن و هەموو لایەک وە کۆمەڵگەی مەدەنی پشتیوانی ئیمتیداد و نەوەی نوێ و ئەوانە بکە تاوەکو بتوانێت وردە گۆڕانکاری لە سیستما دروست بکرێ بۆ دەوڵەت بنرێتەوە سوپاس
Before the panels, I'd also like to encourage, I see quite a few students to raise your hand, and I'll be calling on you in the meantime. Should we take a second? Would you like to? Yes, sir. You want to ask that?
Yeah. So
and once again, please, keep it to 30 seconds and keep it in question format, please.
So my question is for all the panelists. So regarding the government formation talks in Baghdad, so you just saw the Federal Supreme Court in Baghdad, their ruling on the KRG's oil sector, and they defined the KRG's oil and gas law as something unconstitutional, and they mandated KRG to hand over all its oil sector to Baghdad. It seems that the KRG's and Baghdad's leaders are not on the same page about how to implement the ruling. So how do you see this issue, and how it's going to affect the government formation talks in Baghdad? I mean, is it possible to expect that KDP guys and the Kurdish leaders require some compromise from the Sadris about the way the ruling will be implemented, and the way that KRG will preserve some sort of independency in managing the oil sector in Kurdistan? Do you think something like this is possible, given all the political and institutional limitations in Baghdad? Thank you.
Thank you both.
Okay, so regarding the Federal Supreme Court ruling, I think that the KRG will, for the time being at least, maintain a degree of independent oil sales. Obviously, I mean that's also what we've seen through the statements. And I think that, I mean, this issue has been lingering for 10 years? It needed to be resolved at some point. What we're seeing so far is that neither side really seems to have a serious attempt and still, despite the ruling, resolving it. But what's going to be challenging further down the line is really how the IOCs are going to relate to this issue, right? Because it's going to be a greater risk for them to work on these conditions. So I think, yes, I mean, further down the line, we will probably see more deliberations between Baghdad and Erbil on how to resolve this issue. And at the end of the day, I mean, we've seen this before in Iraq. You can ignore these things, at least for a period of time, as long as there is kind of a political understanding behind supporting it. But it's definitely going to be a nail in the eye for the KRG on part of the framework parties. And I think it will require, hopefully, it's going to incentivize the discussion and a solution on this that has been very much needed for quite some time.
Yeah. So, in respect to the gentleman's question about lack of state in Iraq, so the whole theme here, and I think emphasized by my colleagues here, is there is a state, but this state is being captured. We agree that under party rule and party dominance, the line between what is the state and what is the party, what is the public interest and what is the private interest are blurred, and that's the case in Iraq. And the whole point is, will this government formation lead to the rise of a state in the form of a strong prime minister that is not beholden to the parties? You said that Adel Abdel Mahdi wanted to, do some reform, which people disagree with you, I'm sure, especially in the south of Iraq, the way he responded to the pro-Iran parties and others and cracked down on ordered security forces. At least he didn't stop them. So the whole idea is to have a prime minister. That's what Muqtada and his allies are wanting, to have a strong prime minister that is not beholden to the parties and acts on behalf of the interests of the public. I agree. Do we really trust Muqtada? I mean, he's better than the others. Adnan disagree with me, I'm sure. Out of the rest of the parties, he's been less tied to Iran. He mobilizes large numbers of people. He has lots of support, and he stands to do some reform in Iraq. But do we trust him 100%? Nobody can do that. But if you can get a prime minister who's not beholden to militias and different interests, vested interests of individuals and parties, let's try it. It's too early to say it, seriously. I'm as pessimistic as you are, because about Iraq, when you're pessimistic, you'll always be right. Unfortunately, this has been the case. So let's see if he has the prime minister, is he going to be a strong person, not a strong man, a strong prime minister, and will act on behalf of the public interest or not?
Amen.
I'll say just one brief thing. I think, we always have to separate the kinds of terminologies that we use in regard to state or non-stateness. Separate the sort of rhetoric that we might use, let's say, in a protest versus the rhetoric that we use in an academic debate. Totally legitimate for Iraqi protesters to go out in the street and say, there's no Maghoudola, there's no Haguma, whatever. This is an expression of grievance, right? This is an expression of a kind of disillusionment. I have no problems with that. But when we think about this sort of in political science or in academia, a state, there's always, even in the most authoritarian state, there's always some degree of a field of power and of disagreements and of different factions, and it is not this kind of even in the former regime, for instance, during the time of Saddam Hussein, it's not as though you could say this was a simple state, right, where there was no kind of field of power. In Iraq, you could say yes, there's a field of power that is more chaotic and more fragmented than people are comfortable with, right? But it is still, I think it is still, at least academically, one can say that there is a kind of a regime and there is a kind of continuity. We're not in a state of kind of anarchy. But the question politically, on the political side, is what kind of regime do you want to have, right? And it's in that space that I totally concur that people can say there is no state, right?
Any students? There's one in the back. Please make sure to introduce yourself. Then to you, sir.
You too.
Hi, my name is Ahmed. The question for Dr. Zmkan, what are the effects of the talk between al-Maliki and Muqtada al-Sadr to form of the new government? And also, can we count Ja'far al-Sadr as a strong person to lead Iraq?
Shall I just
Please,
go
go
for
right
it?
ahead.
Well, this seems to be a breakthrough, right? We had a stalemate now with Sadr, who had kind of a veto on Maliki. Maliki has won substantial numbers of seats compared to the rest of his allies. So if they are both, if this was the most important hindrance to forming a government, and now there's a talk, then I think there's a breakthrough in this. It's likely now we will have a government. In terms of the personality, again, is he going to act on behalf of a few parties? And when Mohammed Ja'far Sadr, he's a prime minister, if he kind of makes a decision about removing all corruption in Basra's oil sector, right? He needs a backing to do that. Is he going to be there on a kind of a private and elite bargain in a backing deal that, okay, we will allow him to be a prime minister, but he can't touch on our vested interests, of course, across Iraq, where the sources of corruption, the sources of state failure. If he's going to be a prime minister on the basis of that, regardless of who he is, we'll have another 4 years of continuity. Corruption, state failure, more protests.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that, first of all, I'm not very certain that Mohammed Ja'far wants this position. And if he takes it, I think he would be actually forced into it. So I think that what we might see in the period in the process where we are now, if we compare it to previous ones, is that we've also seen that names are, floated, and then we have other names coming up further down the line, and this might be a case of that. I wouldn't be very hopeful in terms of, I was actually quite surprised because your pessimism tends to be all-encompassing, but you seem to have an opening for Sadr. I doubt that one. And I agree with Zmkan that it doesn't matter if it's Mohammed Ja'far or someone else, but I think he in particular, I think, would be quite weak in a sense. I mean, what Sadr's preference would want, or would be, is to have someone that is his own. And that condition, Mohammed Ja'far really fills, I think.
I thought it was kind of funny that, there were certain American analysts that were very kind of happy in a way that there was this phone call between Sadr and Maliki, because they said, oh wow, this proves, if Maliki is okay with Ja'far Sadr, this means that it proves that Kadhimi really has been going after the militias, right? Because he really, doesn't want Kadhimi. And then, I immediately saw a bunch of Iraqi analysts who say, no, this just means that Kadhimi had become so Sadrist that even a Sadrist is less Sadrist than Kadhimi. And so I just think the question is always whoever is in power, whoever comes to be the prime minister, under what kind of agreement, who are their backers. There is no, at the moment, possibility really of having a truly sort of independent prime minister on the one hand, or one that has only the exclusive backing of a single party. So we're in the same boat, I'm afraid.
There were two questions from the gentleman at the front and the gentleman in the second row over there. The bespectacled one, I'm sorry. You raise your hand later on.
Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Kamil, and thanks for the analysis and valuable insight that you offered. I'd like to bring back the issue of recent attack on Erbil again. And my question is, to what extent this attack is novel, as we have seen that Iran, or part of its military fragment, claimed the responsibility, and what do you think of the consequences that will bring in terms of the regional dynamic? And the question is for Dr. Skelton and Dr. Zmkan, and feel free, Ms. Lahib, if you want to comment. Thanks.
I'm going to kind of punt on this one. I think it's clear that there's a message being sent, but what is the message? Dr. Zmkan and I have actually been debating this right before this talk, and he had a much clearer idea than I did, so go right ahead.
Yeah, I think it's about, there is a prospect for a nuclear deal. This is first and foremost a message that Iran, and part of the deal was always used, focused on Iran's missile, the ballistic missiles. This is Iran's first and foremost political and military instrument. So the choice of the place, the timing was interesting because Iran cannot, their capacity to go and retaliate on spies of Israel is really low. They can't do that. What they wanted is to choose a place where they can say we can retaliate for their own public and for the region, and for those who negotiate with them that we're not going to abandon this weapon. We're going to use it. So regionally, the message was we're going to retaliate, but in a place where they can't respond, and it's not going to be costly. It wasn't even against some intelligent basis of Israel in Azerbaijan. This is closer. This is less costly because you don't really have a strong government in the air. It's a free-for-all. You can do it without retaliation. The message is strategic to Israel. We're still here. We maintain our weapons. It is impactful to the Americans, to everyone else. But the political message was what I think one of us just talked about it, is stop being a partner with, basically the KGB leadership. Stop being a partner with, stop supporting Saddam. Because the Iranians are not just worried about now and government formation. They're thinking if they form the government, we need to maintain the pressure on them. So the sound of it, the way that they used this weapon, I think it made some impact. I think the message received by those who were intended to receive the message, both inside the KRI, the rest of Iraq, and in the region and internationally. But why they did it, I think the Russian invasion is setting precedent for these kind of action.
We have time for one final question. The gentleman, you're going to turn it over to him? Okay. Sir, please go right ahead.
نسوشنا لك أصوات من فريد نعم فريدة أملوا دسبكم قصيرة رأس الكردية عقلوية كشغل من الفيديو رخاطها سبارة بيجي بارتي دم كذا هيك أنا شو تبرير كذا بساعة كم دكتور زكان ويا ويك بارتي كان برجوم ديالي كردية عقلوية كتير كان برجوم ديالي كردية شو كبراسي ما ويك سعر بريوبا إيران نك لهنيتر يولا بالشعبية ما نتجار سرور زينة كان كلام درالته إيران مش ودويتي أو أمريكا ما بدو سيابي شو بقامتها سبب باويك منطقة صار اليسار دولتي ده حكومة إسرائيل اجتماعي بيك بينه برای من اما کاری که سکمتونه بید بو لبروی لا شرط چوار میلیشیا که هی سی حاجی شعبی که لیوان هست سری ولی سربا مقتضى صدره اوی که هی سی چوار سی بنز لیوان یک سربا حاجی شعبی امانش حکمی عراق هنده اوی که مقتضى صدر بیکر و کشی دوری صدر لیراوی که نیتوانی لنو حکمت عراق چه خوار و برسی اوی که استا حكومة عراق بريوضة حزب دعوة واني كليم ونحوي لنا هلا وزاعي حزب دعوة هاتو ندر ولا صدر كشي جوري صدر ويقا بو تصرف شورنا مطلوب من الحكومة لها اگر حي وزير الاساسي والله و لێرە دەگەینترین شدەوەیە کە ئایا حکوومەتی هەرێمی کوردستان ئەتوانێت و شەڕێکە لە بەغا هەیە لە بینی شیعەکان لەناو خۆیاندا ئەتوانێت و شەڕە لە خۆی دوورخاتەوە بتوانێت زۆرترین بەرژەوەندی بۆ خۆی بەدەستبێنێت چونکە ئەوەی کە العراق بۆ داشت شەڕی شخصیە لە شەڕی حکوومەت بەتایبەتی لەوێ نوری مالیکی مقتەدا سەدر وە لە عراقیش بەتایبەتیش شەڕێکی تریژەیە شەڕی شخصیە لە نێوان مثلا پارتی دیموکراتی کوردستان و یەکێتی نیشتیمانی کوردستان کە ئەوان ڕازیین بە بەرەمساڵح و ئەویش کاندیدی لە بەرامبەر هەیە کەواتە قەزێکە لە بەرژەوەندی کورد ئەوەیە کە لە بەرژەوەندی میلەتی کورد شخصیە لە ناوەدا بۆ من پێم وایە کە ئەوەی کە گرنگە بوترێ کورد چۆن ئیسفادە لەم ناکۆکەی لەو ماڵی شیعان کات چۆن خۆی تەڕەبگیر ناگرێت دەست ناخۆش.
I'm sorry, sir. We really are out of time. We should take this question. If you still have questions, we'll probably be sticking around in front of the hall afterwards. So feel free to come talk to us. Sorry about that.
All right, I'll just quickly do it, but you guys need to come in. I absolutely agree. I said it. There's the parties come first means that the parties and ruling family members they have unfortunately in the KRI and in the rest of Iraq to an extent they prioritize their own interests over the public interest. The KRG is the factory for a duopoly. We've said this before, and that's the part of the problem. In terms of Sadr not being capable of not having the enough military capabilities to face off to challenge the rest of the militia parties in Iraq. That's true, and he knows his limits, but he doesn't only bank on his armed men, Saleem, but also that's why he has alliances, beyond his own trend with the Sunnis, with the KDP, and he has the capability to mobilize larger numbers of the population. They did prove that they can use their weapons on the other side. Politically, they surrounded the green zone or the international zone, the government facilities in Baghdad for a long time. They can disrupt public life, government, and Saddam knows this. But he thinks he can actually continue the struggle without being in par with, in terms of military capabilities, with the rest.
Yeah, I mean, no disagreement with the layout there. I think maybe I'll just say like two things, and that is that we should be careful also with what we wish for in Iraq, in the sense that, I mean, in a normally functioning democracy, a majority government with an opposition would be great, right? But we know that would carry huge risks here. And I think that we have a precedent, in the post-2003 period, with attempts of a rising authoritarianism, and that we saw, and especially in the second term of Maliki. And I think this is also what, if Sadr would really dominate the political scene, this is again kind of the route that we would start heading down. And we have the indications of that in the KRG as well, with the rise of the KDP. So, is this system extremely inefficient? Is it very, poorly equipped to provide citizens with the basic services? Yes. But we should also be, I think, a little bit cautious about the alternative that would potentially come to fruition if the tripartite alliance in this case would win the victory that it would like to see.
I guess just one final thought would be that, there's often a debate in the social sciences over what is the relationship between participation in electoral politics and the kinds of responsibilities that a given party has to its electorate. And and oftentimes the Sadrists in political scientists are looked at as a case study for the more and more this group gets involved in electoral politics, surely they will do two things. They will start reaching across the aisle and sort of trying to spread the benefits to other constituencies beyond their bloc. And secondly, they will do that through the provision of some kind of services. We see that in the first instance. We do see the Sadrists as they become more and more electorally involved, this kind of expansive approach. But we don't see them doing anything really different when it comes to delivering services within the ministries that they control. And this is not just a problem for the Sadrists. This is every party in Iraq has basically adopted an approach of using the ministry that they control as a site of predation, where they strip the resources of that ministry and then distribute that to constituents, rather than the, standard state-society relationship where you have a ministry, and if you have that ministry, it's an asset, because if you do well in providing services, then people like you, right? But that's not the way it's worked in Iraq. And so the only kinds of services that we see actually working are those that are very basic. And we say working, with it in a qualified sense. So any service that has any degree of complexity, healthcare being the big one, just doesn't work. And will this equation work forever, where each party can basically use its ministry as a kind of resource rather than to purchase through the extension of services political will? I think that's the big question. So with that.
I would like to close the panel on that note. Fingers crossed for Iraq, the Kurdistan region, the Middle East in general. Please join me in thanking our panels, and thank you very much, participants, and for your questions. Thank you.